Good morning. I hope you can see the screen because with the big projector over there, it's a little hard. So, Marie-Laure, thank you for our invitation to bring me here. We did submit the paper. I don't know whether it has been circulated. Has it? No? Or yes? Anyway, the paper we had, or the paper we submitted back in the fall, has been written for Foreign Affairs, which unfortunately turned it down. So now we are looking for an international relations journal where to publish it. And purposefully, therefore, it was not a very academic paper, but I think it was dealing with a couple of important issues. And that's what I'm going to try to summarize here. Now, just kind of an advertising introduction. I just have a new book out called Managing Global Innovation, which is really looking at the managerial and strategic issues of multinational companies around innovation. That's not exactly what I'm going to talk about today. I'm going to take more of an overall perspective on the interaction between locations, cities, countries, states, and so on, and multinational companies. If you look at a very high altitude, at what has been taking place, and unfortunately I could not be here last night, so perhaps you have covered a lot of this ground in much better understanding and depth, but I think the first point to be made is when you look at what is it that in a way destroyed the importance of geography, or if not destroyed it, tried to negate it for a while. It was basically innovative companies or innovative companies that became multinational companies, which shifted from comparative advantage, and comparative advantage had been with us for at least 4 or 5 millennia, since trade in the Indus Valley and the Euphrates Valley, back at 3000 BC or so. But essentially what happened is a handful of companies, which were highly innovative companies, replaced comparative advantage by absolute advantage, essentially introducing products which were innovation breakthroughs and then diffusing them through the world in a relatively uniform fashion. I'm not including in this the first industrial revolution, which was really a consequence of colonial power of Britain over India more than anything else. But there was this move, and that was more a handful of European and American companies mostly at the beginning of the 20th century, which performed their innovation and their R&D and their marketing activities first at home, and essentially, according to the old Vernon life cycle model, expanded internationally as a function of market development in other countries. The driving forces were some form of scale-driven uniformization, so the idea was to have roughly the same products on a worldwide basis. I'm schematizing, I'm simplifying a lot, but just for the sake of limited time. Then one moved toward a form of vertical disintegration of the supply chain and outsourcing, which in a way allowed companies to be both globally positioned and globally efficient, and also to benefit from local costs, advantage, and subcontractors with lesser social costs, and so on. If you look at the Apple Foxconn story right now, you have an example of this at work. And these companies were also characterized in most industries by intense global competition because they were trying basically to compete for the same market. So when you look at this, you have an image of companies that are really exploiting and arbitraging across cost differences around the world. And that triggers what has become known as the race to the bottom. So shirt manufacturing is going, or has moved, from Mauritius to Madagascar, and I don't quite know what's the next place. And before Mauritius, it was in more developing environments. So from Milan, let's say from Milan to Mauritius to Madagascar. So that's roughly what has happened in very stylized form. Now, what I became aware of, and it's not yesterday, it's certainly at least as far, if you remember, of the big demonstrations against world trade negotiations in Geneva and in Seattle a dozen years ago, at the beginning of the 2000s, was that this is simply not sustainable. Makes no sense at all. it's an absurd way of going about it. And it's fueling discontent and extremism. It's fueling all forms of leftist movements, all kind of questions on the basics of capitalism, and rightly so. It's also, I think, encouraging religious fundamentalism, trying to find satisfaction in different ways or different places from the real world. It's also having consequences, for instance, very accelerated urbanization, which in many countries has had tremendous negative consequences, with the breakdown of social structure, with the breakdown of family structures, with the breakdown of essentially regulatory mechanisms that allowed the perpetuation of civilization and societies over time. And I think that has been destroyed, or that is being destroyed. And yet, and we could add a long list. I'm not a left-wing polemist, but if I were, you could hear me for the next 2 hours. But you know the theme. And you know that the theme is not just a theme, it's a sad reality. And it's all the saddest, because it doesn't really need to be that way. I think it's a particular evolution of history, which in some way perhaps brought affordable fridges to Africa 50 years ago, but is now essentially bringing a lot of distortion in the, not just in the economy, but in the social and moral fabric of the world. So I think we need to do differently. And that was basically our message in that paper, to say, well, and here I become a little self-serving, I must admit, we have found, we meaning a few colleagues and I, we have found, or we have identified, and we have built on others. I mean, let's not forget that to tell you the truth, I have a little bit of a survivor's guilt feeling because the people who started talking about this and writing about this around multinational companies were Gunnar Hedlund in Sweden, as you probably know. I'm sure you know Marie-Laure Gunnar, or you knew Gunnar. Gunnar passed away a number of years ago. Sumantra Ghoshal, who was with us at INSEAD and the London Business School, also passed away a few years back. And last but not least, C.K. Prahalad, who was a very close friend of mine for nearly 40 years, also passed away a couple of years back. So in some ways, and I have to be modest here, a lot of this line of reasoning which I'm going to present is not really mine. It's really coming from a long tradition of research, which preceded the more famous or the more visible arguments around the fortune at the bottom of the pyramid, for instance. And basically, what have we been progressively saying? We have been saying there's a traditional model of globalization, of firms, which is essentially exploiting home-based advantage and leveraging this home-based advantage globally. So that's the story of fridges, or for that matter, that's the story of pharmaceuticals from the Rhine Valley to the rest of the world. Or you can argue it's the story of Unilever and so on. And what we have been arguing is there's a whole different way to think of this, and I'm sure this argument is not unfamiliar to you because it's not as if I'd thought this over the past 6 months, which we called 10 years ago multinational. And the basic point there is rather than think about innovating at home and, in a way, pushing the knowledge and pushing the innovation from the center to the periphery, the whole point is learning from the periphery, bringing the knowledge together, not necessarily at the center, integrating that knowledge, developing innovation from sources of knowledge that are distributed around the world, and then leveraging that knowledge on a relatively wide scale, which is a very, very different attitude toward globalization, because rather than thrive on trying to make the world be like your domestic market, it's actually thriving on differences. It's trying to exploit constructively the unique capabilities, the unique competencies, the unique contributions coming from all different places around the world. So it's a very, very different logic. We developed, and apologies for this somewhat busy chart, that's the only summary chart I will present of some of this early work. We developed a framework, we called it at the time the multinational process, where we are basically saying, in addition to what has been studied for a long time, which is the operation plane, when I was doing my PhD dissertation, I was just about literally, not quite, but just about literally sitting in front of Ford plants around the world and counting the number of trucks coming out of these plants and figuring out what they were carrying. So this whole idea of a global supply system, a global supply chain, distributed integrated manufacturing, and so on is not new. What we have added to this in our reasoning is just to say innovative companies need to build a sensing network around the world, or if you wish, a knowledge accessing network around the world to be able to get the best possible capabilities and competencies from all over. And for this to happen, there needs to be what we have variously called in various papers and writings, attractors, magnets, mobilizing nodes, and so on. But the core idea there is a key entrepreneurial role to bring together and integrate all of these disparate contributions and turn them into successful and integrated innovations, which then are exploited and leveraged in the bottom plane. That's roughly the framework. Now, more recently, we have gone into this question of saying, well, what are the implications for the relationship between multinational innovation and local communities? To cut a long story short, the more obvious one has been substitution. So we'll go to India because the software engineers are less expensive than in the US or in Germany. Now, that, it turns out, is largely illusory. It's largely illusory for various reasons. First of all, the cost gap, or the arbitraging, if you wish, of wage costs, is a short-lived phenomenon. In China today, salaries for competent or half-competent engineers increase by 70 to 25% a year. It doesn't take many years for the levels to be more or less the same as in the West. It's also illusory because there are lots of hidden costs. And because these costs do not show clearly in projects, they are kind of buried in communication, travel, and many other things throughout the company. The economic advantage of substitution has been quite considerably overestimated by many early investors in substitution. It's also a huge problem, potentially, not always, but it has been a huge problem in many cases because by its very nature, substitution threatens high-value creation jobs at home. The best people leave first. Sorry, I can't read. Oh, my God. And the others, that won't work. And the others basically stay, but it doesn't work. So the basis there is to say complementarity is good. Complementarity, I mean, really think of an innovation as a knowledge puzzle, which pieces of that puzzle having to be worked and fitted together, but coming from all around the world. And unless you bring all the puzzle pieces together, then innovation is not taking place. Therefore, it's worth nothing. And then you can also add something that some companies have done, which I call discovery here, which is really just going to a place, not really knowing what you will find, but believing you will find something quite interesting. So the European telecom company went to Silicon Valley like 15 years ago because they thought that moving into the internet would require some awareness of local conditions. Another good example, I don't have time to go through it, it's in the book and elsewhere if you wish, but you can think of Novartis. And here is what they do. It's all driven by value, including here. There's a very interesting thing called the Novartis Institute for Tropical Diseases here in Singapore that we studied, which is very deliberately located here, because Singapore has good infrastructure, medical research infrastructure, clinical tests, and so on, and good communication, and it's quite livable for Westerners. Yet at the same time, it's very close to areas in Cambodia and Burma, for instance, where there is a rife preeminence of these diseases. And also what they want to do, I don't quite know how well it's working right now, I should update myself, but it's also use this as a knowledge hub to federate a lot of efforts around the world from rather disparate organizations, a lot of NGOs, public research institutes, foundations, and so on, as well as pharmaceutical companies and others, health systems of countries, to basically crack the issues of a number of tropical diseases. So think value. Now, what we argue in this is to say, it used to be and still is in the mind of too many people, that you get a bit of a curve like this. You have basically an idea that if you deal with complex knowledge, meaning two things, tacit, and tacit means really only revealed in action, and through the complementarity of some situation and some tool. I mean, if you want to read this, it goes back to Polanyi and perhaps earlier, but the best expression of this is from a professor named Tsoukas in, I think in Warwick Business School in England. He's Greek, but he's employed in England mostly. So the knowledge is tacit and it's also context dependent. What do we mean by context dependent? It's knowledge which may be seemingly explicit, but is actually very much dependent on the eyes of the beholder. You will appreciate this. I was given the privilege to visit Jerusalem twice. In an organized visit. In one of those visits, my guide was a tourist guy who obviously was left-wing, liberal, and clearly did not belong in anything but himself. Believe in anything but himself. In the other visit, the tour guide, quote unquote, was someone who actually became a friend of mine, but who is a very Orthodox Jew and a rabbi. I visited exactly the same place, but it was not the same place, because they were giving me a completely different contextual understanding of the same monuments and so on. So, what makes knowledge complex is both the fact that it's tacit, but also the fact that even when it's explicit, I could take a picture of all the monuments in Jerusalem. Even when it's explicit, it's also context dependent. How it is interpreted by people makes a huge difference and gives it meaning. And then also we have, obviously, collocated in kind of a here together now trinity, like in French theater, versus dispersed knowledge. And the conventional wisdom has been, the feasible space here, it's more or less that area. If you are very highly complex, perfume making, you need to do it all in one place. If you are very highly explicit and not context dependent, then you can create funny companies like Topcoder. I won't say what Topcoder is, but it's essentially an internet-based marketplace for software packages, functioning a little bit like an auction market around this, where the main workers are moonlighting crack engineers from companies like Google and a few others. And the general belief has been that you had to kind of move along this axis. There is a missing word here. This should, I don't know why it happened this way, but this should read emphasis. We studied emphasis, and essentially I've been moving this way. Now again, to cut a long story short, try to, forgive me. What we found, and you won't be surprised, is moving the curve dependent on basically three things. One is not trying to be in too many places at the same time. So geography matters, but it does not mean that one needs to be scattered geographically in terms of knowledge as an organization. Two, making a lot of effort in communication and receptivity. And three, optimizing collaboration processes. And that requires a lot of sharing of context and complex knowledge, so that the curve can be basically moved, both in shape. Now, I forgot which is convex and concave. Sorry, I'm not a mathematician, but it's moving from one to the other. And it's freeing a whole territory for innovation on a global scale. Now, what are the implications of all this? I think there are a series of rather obvious implications for governments. The first one is, it's very important for governments to be engaged in a race to the top. And in other words, to invest in education, to invest in infrastructure, to create tax and incentive systems and intellectual property regimes, and you could add a few more there, which are going to allow a migration or facilitate a migration to higher qualification employment. Now, you are going to tell me if everyone does the same, then this is totally self-defeating. And therefore, the second point is one has to think about uniqueness and to cultivate different skill sets. So you can imagine a world, we are not there yet, so we may never be, but you can imagine a world made of specialized pockets of knowledge which contribute to innovation networks or innovation systems which actually span the world. Invest in high-quality infrastructure, because that's kind of beyond the efforts that companies can make. It's what makes a difference. I can tell you I work at INSEAD. The French side of INSEAD is in Fontainebleau, which today is at least an hour and a quarter away from the nearest usable airport. Here, we are completely on the other side of the island from the airport, and when there is no traffic, it's 15 minutes. Makes a huge difference over time. So technology-based infrastructure. Defining some focus areas, not trying to do everything. Give you a little example. I've taken my example from here, it's fun. We studied Singapore with the Economic Development Board some years ago, and we found an interesting little kind of thing. You know, one of the largest container terminal and container exchange terminal is right here somewhere. I don't know which way from here. But the interesting thing is what happens when you lose a container. You know, it's just like lost luggage in airlines that we all have experience of. The Singaporeans, on average, find the container, no matter where it is in the world, in less than 3 days. No other port operator finds the containers in less than 3 weeks. Which means that if you manage just-in-time supply chain systems, that's a huge difference. So we advise the Singaporeans to say, build on this, which to some extent they're doing. They are running port systems everywhere in the world now. Thousands. And therefore move very much as a government, and I struggle with this very much with people in Europe. I mean, public policy people in Europe. Move away from the idea of cluster to the idea of competence hub. Specialized contributor to a global innovation network, rather than trying to build a complete innovation system locally. The role of the government is also to work at societal responses of various types, and this has to do with health, education, computer literacy, whatever else. And then basically the bottom line of this is the countries have to be much more strategic in their globalization. Now, quick example, again from here, 10 years ago. We were looking at Hewlett-Packard. And in the late 1980s, Hewlett-Packard gave the worldwide Center of Excellence mandate for printers, for printer development to Singapore. Great success for Singapore. And a dozen years later, if you look at the printers themselves, nothing much was left. The technology had moved back to the US, and the manufacturing had moved to China and a couple other places. If you look at cartridges, everything was here. And I was told last night, still is, not in this group, but in an earlier conversation I was having. Why? Because the guy who ran cartridges had attracted a whole bunch of other foreign investors with complementary technologies, 3M and DuPont and Bayer and many others less known, started building a supplier of manufacturing equipment base here in Singapore, and integrated very quickly development and manufacturing, and was able to pull the technology into Singapore and was able to relegate the other manufacturing locations within the HP system to essentially becoming assembly plants. And that's still true today. Now, this man was an unusual entrepreneur. He then became the CEO of Singapore Airlines, to give you a little bit of a sense that he was not exactly Mr. Anybody here. But, you know, think cluster and hub, both. And lastly, implication, therefore, for MNC subsidiaries. Engage in very active knowledge seeking and accessing locally. Gain voice. Manage actively the interface with the center. Identify where the subsidiary market is leading and build on it. Be entrepreneurial. Manage flexibility in the relationship with headquarters. Some people have been masters at this. The head of Fuji Xerox, Tony Kobayashi, who turned Fuji Xerox from a market entry joint venture to actually taking strategic control of the whole of Xerox over decades, had immense skills in managing the relationship with the Americans. And then build collaborative innovation networks, both locally and globally. And there are many, many examples. Just to mention two, and then I promise I stop. I was reminded this morning, actually, coming here, of the first of these examples, Matsushita in Singapore. The taxi driver, I was coming from a hotel close to INSEAD. The taxi driver showed me a big space. We were talking about how Singapore was changing every time I was here. Every 6 months, you could see some changes. And he showed me a big empty space, not very far from INSEAD. And he told me I used to work for a plant which was here. And a couple of years ago, 2 years ago, it was destroyed. And now they are going to build ComCity. And I asked him, what is ComCity? He said, well, it's essentially compression and decompression technology for the future of video entertainment and all of these things. And I happen to know how they started. They started because late 1980s, I think, so 15 years back probably, Actually, someone who had studied at INSEAD, a Japanese guy, young guy, was appointed to head a very token laboratory that Matsushita had set up here. And they had set it up only to obtain, or to maintain pioneer status, in other words, to obtain tax breaks from the Singaporean governments, because they were doing research here. So they had hired about 100 poor souls who were not expected to produce anything. Now this man had more interesting thoughts. He was saying, okay, well, what can I do in Singapore? And then to cut a long story short, he said, well, English-speaking, sophisticated Chinese negotiators, not brutal Japanese whatever, people who understand global standardization, lead market for, because it's a small technology-intensive island, lead market for innovations in ICT for consumers. Okay, I'm going to do, guess what? Video compression and decompression technologies, which no one else was doing in Singapore at the time. And then he went around the Matsushita divisions and he started selling his stuff, saying, guys, you don't realize it, but in a few years' time, this is going to be absolutely fundamental. Your beautiful success with videotapes and CDs and so on is going to disappear in the front of online on-demand TV. You better be prepared. And now, I was asking, if the taxi driver was right, he was telling me, yes, Matsushita is going to be one of the big investors in what used to be my factory. Intel Israel. A very young, not young, well, yeah, young at the time, I mean, now he's, but one of the early employees of Israel, of Intel, a fellow named Dov Froman, who happened to be Israeli. I think he had employee badge number 50 and something at Intel. So he was not one of the founders, but pretty close. He decided, after some time soul searching in Africa, that actually he will go Aliyah in Israel, go back home and become religious. The Intel folks were saying, well, you know, we're not going to lose you that easily. Why don't you take a couple of technicians and you start a little pilot operation in Israel? Cutting a long story short again, correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe there are now 3,000 people working in R&D in Intel Israel, most of them next to Technion in Haifa, a few others in kind of high-tech clusters north of Tel Aviv. And twice, they saved Intel by innovations that were actually coming directly from Israel. Now, how did that happen? It was partly the entrepreneurial power of this Mr. Froman, Dov Froman, who retired recently. It was also the fact that Soviet Union, pre-1989, the forbidden cities behind the Ural that no one heard of, which had very few computers. And people were doing paper and pencil, very advanced mathematical computing. And mathematical training in the Soviet Union had remained very good. A lot of these people were Jewish, and even those who were not Jewish took the first opportunity to escape. They moved to Israel. They combined there with a completely different strand of activities, which is the Israeli military had developed a lot of capability in signal intelligence and communication for obvious reasons, trying to figure out what was going on in Damascus at the time. Combining the two together, Intel basically pulled it, combined it with technology from the US, from Japan, from other places around the world, and maintained its leadership. So a lot of this is really around these entrepreneurial skills. So all what I wanted to do is just to you know, French would say brosser, I mean, to go through a very fast landscape setting here, of just saying there can be, contrary to the race to the bottom problems, there can be a way to interact between multinational companies and governments, which can actually be very, very constructive and very fruitful, which builds on, and I'll come back to the main theme of the conference, and I will close on this, comes back to the importance of geography. Rather than deny differences between places, let's, on the contrary, emphasize, discover, find them, build them, take them further, and therefore build these global differentiated innovation networks around the world. Thank you.
I wanted to ask very shortly, especially the story of Intel in Israel is a story of chance, in a sense, yes, of geopolitical changes, of flows coming together suddenly and forming this amalgam that proves very fertile. Is there a way for people to anticipate chance, or to you know, how would you think one could interact with this?
Yeah. You can. Yes, you can, to an extent. I don't know whether I still need to speak in the mic or not.
Yes.
Yes, of course, you can to an extent, but it's not easy. Some people do it in a very aggregate fashion. Like if you know Richard Florida's work about the concentration of the ruling intelligent elites in certain places around the world. Some other people just assume, when I was talking about discovery logic on my diamond earlier on, some other people assume that if you're in the right place, something wonderful will happen. And it does. You know, Novartis, just to give you again one last example, but because the devil is in the detail in those issues. Novartis, some of you are familiar with Cambridge, Massachusetts. There is a place called Massachusetts Avenue, which kind of links MIT or links Boston to Harvard. And it crosses the MIT campus, or closer to Boston. Within that general area of the MIT campus, there was, strangely enough, a chocolate factory making Hershey bars. Do you know who bought that factory? Novartis. Why did Novartis buy the factory in order to be in the middle of MIT? Very clearly, you know, that was the Dr. Herling, the right arm of Daniel Vasella for R&D strategy. He was saying, I want my people to eat in the same cafeteria as the MIT scientists. I want them to be able to walk into the MIT corridors without getting wet or getting cold. I want them to rub shoulders in the same bars at the hotel next door as the visitors to MIT, and so on. So it was very, very deliberate. It's like something is going to come out of it if you're in the right place. Now, it means that you need to be, it's easier perhaps in life sciences like what Novartis is doing. And it's easier when there are kind of hives of related innovative activities around a strong hub like MIT provides. It may be more difficult in other technologies, but I can tell you one thing. Timken was sponsoring my chair years ago. It's an American bearing company, not fancy products. Now, what they predicted very well was that Denmark was the place to go for windmills. How they did it exactly, I don't remember. I don't know. But now, if you look at these windmills, which you can imagine have some of the toughest, biggest bearings in the world, and most expensive, Timken has an overwhelming share of the bearings for windmills. So yes, it can be done. It requires a lot of understanding, analysis, and taking some risks. Sometimes you get wrong. Go to the wrong place.